the panel on Africa. It's fantastic that Basil and his organizing team have given us an hour at this conference. It's not often that Africa gets an hour, despite the fact that our population today is 20% of the world population. Our under 25 population is something like 30% of the world's under 25 population. So very much in a forward-looking, futuristic-looking conference, the continent of tomorrow, and we have to make sure somehow, and speaking as a South African, that tomorrow at some point becomes today and doesn't always remain a continent of tomorrow. Joining me here is a very distinguished panel. You'll have their bios with you, with a range of different expertise, from practitioners, those in the military, to those in the private sector who are looking at Africa from a different lens. Let me just say that Africa doesn't feature much in the US National Security Strategy. For those of you who've read it, it really features only in as much as there are counter-terrorism efforts and then the need to secure critical minerals. And that's become a key part of America's strategy towards Africa, just as it has been a key part of China's strategy towards Africa, and indeed increasingly so of Russia's. I should say, just as by way of introduction, today Africa has about 1.5 billion people. We'll have 2.5 billion people in less than one generation from now. Since 2000, we've had over 110 coups or coup attempts, 34 of which were successful, and since 2020, some 20 coup attempts, and of which 11 were successful. There's a band of instability running virtually from the Horn of Africa all the way to West Africa, across the Sahel, which has resulted from this, and it's become internationalized through the involvement of Russian private military companies, specifically Wagner, now of course known as the Africa Corps. So we have this large population, very youthful population, median age is around 18. We have this coup belt, as it's known, across the Sahel, and we have those, such as the people represented here today, who are trying to create a more stable continent, to raise growth rates economically, so as to move that line further south in Africa. And by that line, I mean the line above which people want to go northwards and come to Europe. We're trying to move it to move it north so that people remain in Africa and not move it south. More people want to travel to Europe and to other parts of the world. And finally, just until now, aid as a method of development, aid as a method of security assistance has not been effective enough. I won't make a value judgment as to whether it's been effective at all, but it certainly hasn't been effective enough. Since 1960, since the time of African independence in the main, nearly $5 trillion in today's money has been spent on Africa. And one of the big disruptions that's happened over the last 2 years has been the ending, more or less, of American aid, from which a lot of others have taken their lead and have moved aid elsewhere, or indeed back into their militaries from European aid givers. But other aid projects have also not been terribly successful, as you see in the results. African economies have declined in per capita income terms this century, particularly when measured against the rise in global per capita incomes. So we have to think about this problem differently. The challenge posed by the US National Security Strategy is to think about this in a more transactional way. I think we were forbidden earlier from using that term, but I'm going to use it regardless. But of course, much of this is dependent on Africa owning the problems and owning the solution. So the themes we've heard about over the course of today have been about forward-looking, about integration, about modernization, about funding, about innovation, about training, and about investment. And these are all things which are in their infancy in parts of Africa, less so for some than for others. So the first question, and I'm virtually going to run down here if it's all right, from right to left, and that's geographic, not political. To ask General Kibochi, who has served as the Chief of Defense Staff of Kenya, one of the force enablers and integrators on the continent, what, from your perspective, how do you see your future challenges, and how do you see the way in which they are being approached in terms of modernization and integration in Kenya as solving some of these challenges?
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Greg. I think I look at it, first of all, look at it from the continental level, and look at Africa as a body that has a lot of potential. To the extent, as you said rightly, we seem to have the largest cohort of young people. We are 1.5 billion people at the moment. And we seem to also have a pool of resources that have never been exploited. And the question that links to that is why and how can that be transformed into prosperity. And I think one of the sheer challenge we have purely is because of security. Security is the enabler that will allow the continent to prosper. And for security to take place, we need to have proper governance, particularly in the whole of Africa. You talked about the question of coups in the Western African belt. And the question you ask yourself, why is that happening, is because of poor governance and accountable governance. I don't support coups, but you will see to a large extent the motivation of those that have gone into that is because of unaccountable governance. So coming down, obviously, to the institution of defense in the continent, we have a very serious challenge in terms of funding defense. And if you don't fund defense as one of the enablers, as you said, for security, then there is a huge challenge that we may not be able to even translate what we are calling a shift from aid to investment. How do people invest in areas that are insecure? And for that to happen, we have to be able to professionalize defense. Defense professionalization, meaning that we need to have proper reformation of the defense institutions. In Kenya, for instance, we have had a deliberate effort to modernize our defense forces. As you said, I've commanded for quite a long time in the Kenya Defense Forces. Defense forces must be responsive to the population. It must be controlled by the civilian authority. And for you to have that, you have to have a professional capabilities. Now, these capabilities run across all domains. We're talking about land, air, maritime, and now cyber, which is a critical domain. So answering the question is that what we need is to professionalize the forces, but those forces must serve under accountable governance structures. If the governance structures are not right, then certainly the institution of the military will be challenged to deliver security.
Thank you, General. If I may ask you from your experience, particularly as CDS, what worked better in terms of external security assistance and provision from where you sat? What proved less useful and what proved very useful as a force enabler for the Kenyan Armed Forces?
I think over time, what what we've had in the Kenyan Armed Forces is partnerships. You will know that Kenya, obviously, was under the British colonialism. So we've inherited a lot of doctrinal underpinnings from the British. Most of us are trained in Britain. And I think over time, that partnership has been very useful. And I say this because it has been a partnership of helping to establish the institutions. Because what has happened in the Western African region, and as you see, there seems to be a challenge from the French who have been in that region for many years, in terms of how the forces there have been able to conduct themselves. You must ask yourself, why is it that out of all the countries that have had coups in the last 5 years or 6 years, why is it that they come from the Francophone countries? There has to be a reason, and I think the reason is because of the lack of the nurturing, the mentorship of those forces to become professional and to be able to respect the civilian authority. So I think that has worked for Kenya, and I think it has also worked for a number of countries that were colonized by the British.
Thank you very much. Brigadier Chipili, Zambia has undergone an enormous transformation over the last 4.5 years. You suffered a populist government, I think best described it. I don't expect you as a professional soldier to make comment, but a populist government that went had an addiction to spending other people's money and borrowed very heavily in international markets to the point that it couldn't meet its debt obligations. And you had a businessman come in as a new president 4.5 years ago, and he's had to clean up the fiscus. He's had to restore the balance sheet, a balance to the balance sheet, and he's had to get investors interested again, helped by the critical minerals era. What role has the armed forces played in this peaceful, internal, democratic transformation on the one hand, and how do you position yourselves to be able, in an environment of fiscal scarcity, to be able to project ahead to the types of challenges that you face? Because you're squeezed between Zimbabwe to the south, Mozambique to the east, and Malawi, none of which are considered particularly stable, Angola to the west, more stable than most, and then the Congo, potentially stable, but not so in reality, to the north. So how do you fund yourself and get ahead of the game in this environment?
Thank you so much, Greg, and a lot of thanks go to Basil and the organizers of this wonderful summit. Before I get to your question, Greg, I saw something today on BBC where they were saying with the war in Iran, the world might just turn to Africa as a source for critical energy requirements. And so here we are discussing Africa, because Africa now might be just more important than it has been in the past because of that reason. You're right, Greg, and where we are coming from was a critical period that required the defense to be at their optimum in terms of professionalism. So the role that the defense played was to oversee the change, the transition, so that it is peaceful, and also to be there to provide a conducive climate for this transformation which we are beginning to see now to take place. And how did we do that? We did that by ensuring that the defense force remained apolitical, non-aligned, and professional. The time leading up to the elections in 2021 was quite a very tense one, and it required the involvement of the military, other than the police who are mandated with the role of ensuring that domestic security is upheld. And the military came in, and all potential pockets of violence were quelled. And I think it's not every day in Africa, Greg, that you see a peaceful change of government from one party to the other. But that is what we experienced. But like you rightly put it, we were squeezed. We are still squeezed. The fiscal space is not enough. And we are talking here of ensuring that the military are supported. We're talking here of ensuring that the military budgets are increased, but we had domestic issues to deal with to ensure that the country was afloat. And so it had to require a certain understanding in the rank and file so that they buy into the program of the government to ensure that we support government to attain stability. And what that meant, Greg, was that certain programs that required monies had to be prioritized. And the priority, obviously, was to operational activities, to ensure that the military remains professionally and operationally active in areas that needed their presence. As you know, Zambia is a unique country with 8 neighbors. And we need to ensure that we have presence in all these borderlines. And it's not an easy one. You have the Congo with a borderline of over 1,000 kilometers with the Congo. So priority had to be areas that require operational efficiency. And we are beginning to see the fruits of the military remaining subservient to the civilian authority and supportive to the civilian authority by now a relaxation of some of what I may term austerity measures within the military ranks, and we are beginning to see things ease up. But what was important was, like I said, to ensure that these government measures are explained to the rank and file. We are lucky today that we have soldiers that are quite educated. So if these things are explained in the way they are supposed to be explained, they are able to get it. So what was required was the military top brass leadership explaining these things to the rank and file, and they buy into it, and we move together.
I was recently fortunate enough to give a book presentation at the Higher Defense College in Lusaka, which coincidentally, of those who are students of history, was once the African National Congress Liberation Movement in South Africa's headquarters, and now become a defense college. And when we got to handing over books at the end, every time I handed out a book to another person, they gave me a book in return, because these were soldiers who'd written about their experiences. So you wouldn't have found that 20 years ago, I don't believe, certainly not 40 years ago. It's a completely different Africa, which we have to remind ourselves on. Vlada, who is with Oracle, Galan, who's with Oracle, I want to ask you, if I may, about your perspective on how the relationship with the outside world is changing. And for many people in the West, Africa is a problem to be solved, not an investment opportunity to be entertained. But there is a danger in being too transactional about this, because the struggle for democracy in Africa was a struggle. It wasn't something that leaders woke up to one day, and this is why I mentioned the ANC, and decided that they would be benevolent and hand out democracy because they had a change of heart. But we are facing widespread democratic regression across the continent. There are 54 African countries, 55 if you count differently. Of those, only 10 are classified by Freedom House as democratic, 45 are not. The larger amount is the partially free countries, and there's about 20 hardcore unfree countries underneath that. Isn't there a danger that a more mercantilist, a less, let's say, human rights or democratic-centric policy by the outside world towards Africa sees regression? And with regression, we have reduced economic performance. Because while Asia, autocrats might govern themselves well because there's a commitment to popular welfare, the record in Africa is empirical and it's clear. The more autocratic, the worse the governance standards. There's a couple of exceptions. We don't really know because we can't trust the statistics. The exceptions don't always last forever, but generally the worse the democracy, the worse the performance, and that's just in economic terms, not in human rights terms. So how would you see the changes in the outside world towards Africa? And do you think this is good or bad, or how should they be adjusted?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to Basil and the team for the wonderful summit that they've put together. I have a home in Zimbabwe. I absolutely love the African continent and have worked on it for 12 years. I'm a guest, although not a full native. And what I can tell you is that nothing that Africans hate worse than the outside world telling them what to do. And one of the biggest problems that I've encountered with Western countries, specifically the United States, where I'm also a passport holder, is the fact that they continually want to tell the Africans how to run their elections, how to run their minerals. I think Africa accounts for about 30% of the world's critical minerals. And the Western world always wants to tell the African continent how to dictate their future. And I think it's a massive mistake. It creates resentment from top to bottom, and Africa becomes a battleground for proxy states. And we've seen the influence of U.S., China, that battleground playing out in Africa. You've seen Turkish expansion. You've seen the expansion of the Gulf states entering in countries like Zambia. IHC just took on Mopani mines. So you see this kind of battleground playing out on the continent. And what's really important is good governance is critical. It's my background, it's what I work in. I do elections all over the world. It's critical. But on the African continent, there really needs to be a trade perspective and an investment perspective from the Western countries. And what you've seen is aid, not trade. And what you've seen with the current Trump administration is they've brought in Mossad Boulis, who's now the special envoy from the Trump administration to the African continent, who has consistently said trade, not aid. So the U.S. is seeing a different perspective when it comes to Africa under this administration. Unfortunately, we've yet to see any results come out of that in this administration because they've been focused on other conflicts, and it's been like putting out fires all over the world. And so I'm really interested to see what happens over the next couple years when it comes to that. And that'll be very interesting to see. But when it comes to African countries' minerals. I worked closely with the president of Zimbabwe over the last 7 years when it comes to the mineral sector. And this is someone who's sanctioned by the United States. And what you see is a lot of these sanctioned actors just go underground. So they still continue to operate. You have people across the continent, from Uganda to Zimbabwe to DRC, sanctioned individuals that just operate with proxies fronting for them. So I know the West feels like they get involved in reinforcing these democratic processes and using sanctions as a tool, but the problem is that it doesn't work that way. These people just go underground. They work through proxies that set up holding companies in the Mauritius and the UAE, and this is a massive problem. But in Zimbabwe, without really a lot of U.S. support, the GDP expanded by 7.5% recently, which is really surprising. Economic output grew by over 30%, and in cumulative terms since 2018. And so this is a country that came from massive hyperinflation. We know that Zimbabwe's been under various sanctions programs for the last 20 years, not as a country, but institutions were sanctioned. And despite that, inflation fell to the single digits. And this is a really great case study, and part of that was done on revitalizing the entire mineral sector. A large part of that is backed by the gold sector. They had a huge boom in the mining sector, and a slogan of being open for business, despite the fact that for 20 years there's been this kind of stigma of sanctions. And so it's one example to show that the West doesn't always have to get involved in every single election process and dictate the future of the African continent. The entire continent is not going to regress as a whole. And the problem across the continent is, look at Kagame. The West was a huge supporter of Kagame in Rwanda. He's been there for quite some time and overstayed the welcome at some point, going to the very undemocratic things that the West stands against with human rights violations and opposition. Now, I think he's been a great leader for Rwanda in the beginning, but over time these things sour. Look at Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, great leader supported by the West in the beginning, and look at where that went. And then look at DRC, Congo. I mean, you got rid of Joseph Kabila. Okay, good decision, who's next? And now you have an issue again. Look at how elections are going there. And so I think that the West has this tendency to get involved, and I think we have to be very careful to play that line very carefully. And if we are going to get involved, it's not throwing aid money to help people learn how to protest or useless programs. It's actually entering into real partnerships that help develop the continent and build out various sectors.
I think we can have an argument about this, but because I think Jethrow knows my perspective on this well, having been part of the advisory group that ended inflation in Zimbabwe, which was mostly about dollarization. But Bobby Wine, who's something of a legendary African figure in contemporary politics in Uganda, he has a very simple line when he talks about the West and how they should help the democratic movement, which of course is beaten, abducted, disappeared, and every other imaginable horror in Uganda, amongst many other countries, including Zimbabwe. They have a current constitutional amendment which is going to extend the period of presidential rule, which everyone's very unhappy about, and there's lots of unhappiness about this. He says, if you don't want to get involved, don't get involved. And I think he's 100% correct, but he says, but don't fund our oppressor. So if you're not going to get involved, don't get involved. But don't get involved on the other side, which is often the segue to the nature of the involvement. Yeah, we'll do business with the bad guys. We'll give them strategic aid, but it ends up funding the oppressor. So no involvement would be a good thing, but keep it at that.
Well, I think the danger is that then you create resentment that brings in a total open playing field for countries like Russia and China. And you see them taking critical minerals, and you see them moving. Look at Russia trying to put a port in Sudan. So you really have to be careful to play that line.
Yeah, but paradoxically, the more democratic, the less likely there is to be Russia or China. But that's a different argument. Chris, I want to get to you. You have a different perspective on the DRC. They used to say about Brazil, a country of tomorrow and always will be. The DRC has been our Brazil, a country of tomorrow always would be. It has been a terrible blight for its citizens for much of the last 60 years of independence. The remarkable attachment that the Congolese have had towards their state is remarkable simply because it's done them so badly in the main. It has had a convulsing series of wars, and I think it's the result, if I could be academic for a sense, of the way in which the majority of African states were created. They were created by colonial fiat. So in the case of Europe, most states were created around ethnic identities and they expanded power through taxation and the building of armies to borders. Natural borders, or where their abilities, their projection of power petered out against another power coming in the opposite direction. In the African case, the borders were simply drawn on a map. They were imposed, and they included many nations. They're not nation states, they are nations states for the most point, and we've had to work around this. We've had to try and manage this conglomerate of different interests, different forces, different regional interests in the case of the Congo. And what Mobutu Sese Seko did very successfully was he reduced the threat to his rule by running the Congolese state down. So he made it not speak to each other over his 40-odd year period of rule, and essentially it sort of disassembled itself. So how do you see the Trump policy, and I know you're close to the critical minerals sector, of which the Congo is a treasure trove, how do you see Trump's policy playing out in a place like the Congo, and of being of benefit not just to the Congolese state or to the American taxpayer or to the tech business, but to the Congolese people and the Congo's neighbors?
Well, thank you. I didn't know you would go all the way back to 1895, but yes, so the question as a whole, we work in DRC, we're a private company, we have a contract with the government to do capacity building in the fiscal sector. So basically, optimize the collection of revenue in the extractive sector. So we are not official representation of US policy, but we certainly like to see ourselves as having a certain type of compact and provide access maybe, so that this policy could be enacted properly in terms of allowing for those critical minerals to go from Congo to the West, to the United States. And that is a challenge, and the challenge is multiple, of course. I'm not going to go into the confederation of the DRC, if you want to call it this way, or the issues in the East. But essentially what you have is, how do you make a private sector investment de-risked or bankable in DRC with the governance issues that everybody knows and broached upon on this panel, and overall security problems. So the way from our Western model, the way we want this to benefit the Congolese people, it is to help the Congolese government transform their strategic assets or critical minerals into tools for sovereignty. So we want to open up the playing field and allow Western actors to come in a de-risked fashion. And that could be simple things like, do you enforce contracts? Does the justice sector in Congo allow for an arbitration to happen when there's a problem over a concession or a license right? That could be, how do you deal with the invasion of an artisanal mining syndicate that is going to loot your concession with the protection of some, local power broker? So all these issues have a fiscal impact for the government in Congo and hurt their sovereignty, because they cannot then reinvest in their country, and at the same time it pushes away the deep pockets and the big Western firms that could come with proper HSE models, with local development, and also a fiscal discipline, in the sense that they would pay their taxes. So in general, if you look at the policy of the present administration, my take on this as a private sector individual is that you have three basic components. You have US diplomacy that wants critical minerals. You have the Congolese government that needs the capacity building to be able to provide private investors, private mining companies, the ability to make this investment bankable. That's the only way that it benefits the country. So it's more a model kind of approach. It's nothing new when you think about it, but we don't pick winners. We don't plan our economies. We just have to say, well, for this to work, how do we work with the private sector, meaning ourselves, and private investors, to make sure that when His Excellency the President says Congo is open for business, there are actors that are willing to come, and the Congolese government is able to provide a framework that is acceptable as a protection. And that mechanically will result into better outcomes for the Congolese people.
Okay, can I throw this back at you and say, it sounds fantastic. You know, American companies coming involved, presumably they listed, so there's elements of corporate governance. They have to declare to their shareholders how they're going about business. There'll be higher standards, higher levels of accountability. But let's look at the way in which China has approached the critical minerals sector in Africa. And Zambia is a great case study in this regard. The Chinese go out there. They send very large numbers of people out to work in these sectors. Problem number one, not a lot of Westerners probably want to go and work in the middle of the Congo right now. But put that aside for a second. Maybe they're out there, we just don't know about them. Maybe they're in Middletown, America, and they really want to get to the Congo. And then the Chinese have very low costs of capital, very high rates of output, and they are operating in gray areas sometimes in terms of governance. Less the safety standards that you would prefer, less the worker labor standards that you would prefer. They're operating sometimes on, sometimes beyond those margins. But they are commercial. They are operating on a commercial basis. They're buying entities, they're buying all sorts of assets, they're sweating those assets, and they're moving material because they have to. So why doesn't the United States do that?
Well, yeah, I can comment a little bit on the Chinese presence in Congo. It is the first economic partner of Congo, and there is several tiers of Chinese actors over there, some of them perfectly above board and very productive, and some others that are questionable by the way they're able to exploit a form of weak governance and basically strip the Congolese soil of its minerals and do absolutely nothing for the country. Just export it illegally, sometimes using the rebel-held areas, and that's just, I don't know, it's hard to estimate, but it's in the billions of dollars of loss fiscally for Congo. Those are Chinese actors, and there's pre-financing, their purchase, it goes straight back to China. I agree with your first point that the model that we want to put forth is not only a diplomatic model, a declarative model. It's something where you allow for private sector people to enter into transactions, actually take risks, put skin in the game, and interact with local suppliers, local government, and build trust that way. Not just, as Vlada said, by doing performative declarations or standing on principle. And the Chinese don't do that. It's perfectly true. I don't know. I think one of the, and that's, I mean, we have a very recent example with Virtus Resources that bought him off. So that's one first U.S. operator, U.S. company that built a consortium and found some operators, and I agree that we're not Americans. I don't know why the U.S. has less miners today than they had in the past. We still have some very big companies. We're not Canada, we're not Australia, we're not South Africa. This is probably going to be the concrete way to go in terms of finding the workforce and the skill and the know-how. But essentially there's an appetite. And the appetite is mostly held back by the fact that all the treatment plants are in China. So it's a bit of a circular argument. Like, you're looking for investors and you're like, well, come and help me out. I'm going to go replenish the critical mineral stash of the Department of Defense. You know, I'm going to have some maybe public capital to back me up or some guarantees. And the people are going to say, well, what's the point? Because we have no treatment plant. So it's going to have to go to China anyways. And we'll buy the metal. We won't buy the hydroxide or the bulk. And on the other hand, like, if you want to invest in the States and build a treatment plant, which some people are doing right now, the investors will say, well, we don't have access to the supply because it's in Congo and we don't have U.S.-owned company, or we have to go through some broker, that's going to do that. So one of the reason, and that's what we're trying to kind of like, not us, be part of this. How do we make a corridor investable? How do we make something where the West can come and say, well, we do have access to the supply now. We do have maybe a local treatment plant. Maybe we have one in the States. We find, all the operator issue is like a little bit beyond me. But I think these are basically the contextual problems that make the deal or the policy that the Trump administration put forward a little delicate to put in place.
I mean, I think the general lesson from someone such as myself, and I could probably see Jethrow smiling at this, is don't behave like an aid agency and talk about it forever and have workshops about it. Do it. Because we're waiting for you to do something. And that's the frustration with Western actors, is they seem to get absolutely sort of torn up in process forever. So it's welcome news. But do make it happen, because others are going to steal a march on you otherwise. General, I want to change in the last 20 minutes direction slightly. Mm-hmm. There's been a very big development in your region with the recognition by Israel of Somaliland. Now, for those of you who don't understand what Somaliland is, at independence, there were 5 stars in the Somali mindset. One was Italian Somaliland, which is basically Mogadishu and surrounds. British Somaliland, which is Hargeisa and the port of Berbera, which you would have seen in the news. French Somalia, which is now Djibouti. Ethiopian Somali, which is, I think, Region 9, is it?
Yeah.
Region 9,
yeah.
Which is the old Ogaden. And then northwest Kenya, which was another region. So Somaliland, 3 days after its independence, British Somaliland decided to join up with Italian Somaliland, and then spent the next 30 years regretting the decision, ended in a terrible civil war. They self-declared effectively a version of UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence, in 1991, and they have essentially operated as a state ever since then, unrecognized de jure, but de facto, yes, by the international community. And then recently Israel took the step of recognizing Somaliland, and I believe the ambassador of Somaliland to Israel is in the audience, and so congratulations for that to them, for a state that works perfectly well but is not recognized by the international community. How is that going to change, positively or negatively, and particularly in the area of defense, politics in the East Africa, Horn of Africa region?
I think the first is Somalia is Kenya's neighbor. We have 700 kilometers of border, very porous, where the insecurity from the terror group Al-Shabaab comes from. But beyond that, Somalia, as you know, is a critically important country within the east coast of Africa, with a lot of minerals resources and 3,000 kilometers of coastline. But the challenge in Somalia is because of the clan-based system. And you talked about the Northern Frontier District in Kenya, which is inhabited mainly by people of Somali origins, the Ogaden in Ethiopia. The unitary state in Somalia cannot hold. And as you know, the current constitution, as is drafted, is passed, it recognizes a federalist system. Okay? Right now, as you know, there are 5 regional governments: Jubaland, Puntland, the southwest. You have the areas of Galmadug. And these areas are supposed to be self-governing from a federal state kind of view. And Somaliland also belongs to that federation. Unfortunately, Somaliland would like to get away from this federation. Now, what's the import of that is that you might also end up having other states like Jubaland that we border, wanting to be independent. But from a regional perspective, we strongly believe that a federated Somalia is best for Somalia, because it is also a prerequisite for regional stability.
What was the Kenyan Army's experience in its mission in Somalia?
The Kenyan Army has been there. We have been in Somalia since 2011. We are still there. We have a huge interest in what happens in Somalia. As I said, our coastal region that attracts most of the tourism industry in Kenya is dependent on the Kenya Defense Forces security. So we have deployed quite a huge component of a brigade plus in Somalia. But for the region, it is important. And I think the fact that Somalia has become a member of the Eastern African community is a good thing, because it's easy to work around a regional effort towards stabilizing Somalia.
But with such geography and such distances involved, 3,000 kilometers of coastline, this must demand investment in unmanned aerial reconnaissance and the like.
One of the reasons, in fact, one of the problems in security in Africa is just not the land borders that are very, very critical. As you said rightly, 1884 Berlin Conference, Africa was subdivided without them being there, and you were asked to take it or leave it. And therefore, those coastlines, those borders that were recognized by the African Union as the genuine borders are what we have to go by. Now, one of the challenges you have is that borders are economic drivers. If you don't have secure borders, you cannot have intra-trade within the continent. You cannot have investments coming into the continent. Secondly, in the maritime domain, you will know, for instance, that Africa has a very huge exclusive economic zone of about 13 million square kilometers and a coastline of about 30,000 kilometers. Now, you're looking at a resource, for example, when you talk about the blue economy exploitation. How do you secure investments to exploit for resources, oil, for example, on those areas, fishing, which now have been left for illegal fleets to come and collect maritime resources. So the only way you can do that is having a maritime capability. Today in Africa, as you know, the only countries with, especially in the sub-Saharan Africa, with sizable naval capabilities is South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and the rest have now. And 39 countries have coastal boundaries. So we therefore are looking at defense and security being a key prerequisite for attraction of investment and for spurring intra-African trade, and particularly under the African Free Trade Agreement, under the Vision 2063 of the African Union. It is critically important that the national governments, first of all, as a prerequisite for integration, because borders also promote integration. We have to have secure borders to be able to integrate as a continent, and also to create conditions for development to take place. So there is obviously a sense that the continent is aware of these particular issues. You must be aware that there is now a debate about the reforming the structures of the continent, you know, so that they can respond to the changing geostrategic situation. But I think it's important also not to have to lose sight of the fact that the continent is as you said rightly, is 55, 54 countries. And for you to cohesively bring these 54 countries is not a very easy thing. I think Europe took a long time to be able to create the union that they have currently. Africa has been, I was surprised to hear Americans saying they celebrated 250 years of independence. Now, in Africa, we talk about 60 years. The longest is 70 years. So we're still there, we're moving, and one of the key reasons why I think there is a lot of optimism is that if you have this youthful generation, that is about 60%, and this generation is well educated, well grounded, a generation that is not ethnically based, because one of the challenges in African democracy is ethnicity. Because as you say, a country does not belong to one ethnic group, it belongs to 20, 30, 40. So these young people are the future for the continent in terms of transforming it to the Africa we want as per 2063.
Thank you very much, General. We've got 9 minutes left, and I've got 3 questions for the other 3. So briefly, Brigadier, Zambia's had a lot of experience in UN and African peacekeeping operations. What have you learned?
Yeah, it's true, Greg. We have a lot of experience within the continent and outside of the continent. The first UN mission that the defense forces in Zambia participated in, I think, was in Iraq. And then locally in Rwanda, in Angola, Mozambique, and the ongoing one in Sierra Leone, and the ongoing one in Central African Republic. The pre-deployment training, I want to talk about pre-deployment training because it has been an area of interest, particularly from the US, the British, the French, and now the Chinese want to be part of the pre-deployment training. And their argument is very interesting. One Chinese senior colonel told me, you are collaborating with the US on pre-deployment training, but which UN missions have they been to? We have more experience in the UN than the US. It made sense, but probably it is the layers of collaboration which he may not have clearly understood. Our participation in all these UN missions and Africa Union missions, including those under the auspices of SADC. We've participated in Lesotho under the auspices of SADC. There have been a lot of lessons that we have learned from there, which have been shared for the betterment of tomorrow's UN missions. And lessons from there actually start from the soldiers knowing the consequences of war and not daring to do anything that may bring similar situations like they have found in the mission areas. For your interest, Greg, you may wish to know that Zambia was the pioneer of the female engagement teams. Female engagement teams in the Central African Republic constituted teams of just female soldiers who attend to the needs of the female population in the area in which they are operating. Because there are certain cultural underpinnings in the areas where the troops will be operating from, which may not allow the males to attend to the victims of the conflict I'm talking about women and children. So we constituted female engagement teams in the Central African Republic, and this was commended very highly by the Secretary General. And they are seeing how Zambia can be used as a model to replicate the female engagement teams in other UN missions.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Vlada, how do we ensure, as a quick guide, that the tantalizing prospect of a critical minerals era is not missed by Africa?
Well, you have some very optimistic movement. 14 countries on the continent, I believe it's 14, have banned the export of raw minerals. So really trying to take things back into their own hands, create processing on the ground in some of these countries. And I think this is really, really important. It's also going to take a lot of support from the West and critical countries like the United States to really get involved and to play ball. And that means putting aside sometimes the fight of human rights. Are we fighting the democracy human rights fight, or are we fighting a different fight of US national security interests, for example? And that's something that the US struggles with bipartisan across the board. And so that is what has to be decided on the Western front. But the continent is making some great strides. You know, DRC is troubling. Look at Primera Group that came into DRC. You know, I know that my colleague here on the stage talked about the fact that, you know, they're making strides for big companies to come in. Well, a big company did come in and wanted to control all the gold export coming out of DRC. And it was destroyed in the media. Nobody wanted to stop the smuggling, and completely was pushed out of the country. And then the government took the shareholdings back. And so, you know, it takes a bit of both, and the West and has to meet halfway.
So, Chris, a variant of the same question, and you almost have the last word. How do we know that President Trump's new strategy towards Africa is successful? What are the metrics?
Well, I would say the metrics is, are we speaking to partners who are sovereign and who will engage with our private sector properly? Is in the case of Congo, one of the tangible examples is we were privileged enough to work with their authority of critical minerals and their quota exports and all this, and we saw under of course the guidance of the governance and our role as advisors, the price of cobalt go from $26,000 a ton to $56,000 the next year. And we also built the system to control the export, the legal one. So we helped them monitor their policy, extract more fiscal revenue, and build this type of sovereignty, which will then give predictability to actors coming in. So for me, the KPI, which is a term I don't like, but it really is the Trump administration leaning towards building sovereign partners and shedding maybe in the process some existing relationships that are too transactional or maybe too much based on security? Are we trying to can we export our model in a transactional way that builds trust and that is tangible for the economic development of these places while maintaining their sovereignty? This for me is the success point. To have a difference. I don't want to compare with other blocks or groups, but we all have in mind the overly security against minerals of the Russian style, or maybe extraction without benefit for the population of the Chinese model. That would be my hope.
Well, thank you. I think we've had a tour de force here from the four speakers who've brought very different perspectives, which is always rich and valuable. I mean, I think I'd just take two things away which are reinforced time and time again. Is my era or generation struggle in South Africa was all about democracy, but it was. And that was the big defining shift that we undertook from a exclusive system to an inclusive system, and all the changes and difficulties that have come with that. That was almost the last step in the liberation movements of South Africa or of Africa. The next liberation is about the old ways of doing things. It's about the old colonial extractive model, which more or less took over entirely a change of faces, but the same model was applied for the next 60 years. And as General Kibochi said, that younger generation who is tech savvy, who integrated, who majority now whom living in African cities, where only 20% were living in cities in 1960, it's quite a different continent. It was George W. Bush who said, rather unfortunately, I think it was a slip of the tongue, he said Africa is a nation. Well, Africa is many nations, it's many countries, and it's highly differentiated. Just like South Africa has little in common with Somalia, in the same way that Portugal has little in common in some respects as Poland in terms of its strength, in terms of its difficulties and weaknesses. And I think what you've heard here is the need to look at the continent with a very nuanced perspective of that difference more than the fact that it's one thing. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good job.